Excellent. So I want to give you a little bit of a background here. So we've been into HPC since the beginning of KAUST in 2009. And with a BlueGMP, 16 racks of BlueGMP, we delivered more than 1 billion core hours to hundreds of users at KAUST and around the globe, the collaborators of KAUST that generated a couple of petabytes of data. And we are moving now toward our next supercomputer. Our next procurement was based on users' needs, and those are the applications that we've been running at Shaheen 1, our BlueGMP. And 2 years ago, we held a workshop where we brought all the users to tell us which kind of a platform they need to have a better platform to run their workloads. Okay, so that varies from weather modeling to seismic imaging and seismology. You have some graph analysis and quantum chemistry and computational mechanics. All right, so what we end up with is most of our users were not ready for accelerators at that time, and we end up with Shaheen 2, that's XC40 based on Haswell CPUs, and that's providing more than 5 petaflops of compute power and 6,000 nodes and layered memory from 128 memory per node, burst buffer with SSDs, and 500 gigabytes per second of bandwidth for the storage. Now, the main issue here is that our data center can not handle more than 2.8 megawatts. And the solution is we have no way around it. We have to go for accelerators for our next upgrade. So our upgrade plan is based on accelerators. So we are at the same time in Intel Parallel Computing Center and looking at night landing and so on. And at the same time, we're at CUDA Research Center, and we are working with NVIDIA in different aspects to train our users and prepare them for the future. So we hold a workshop in accelerating scientific applications using GPUs in February. And in addition to that, we had a hackathon. It's a mini hackathon for 2 days where we brought our users and we worked with them, mentored them to run their codes into GPUs. All right. So in addition to that, we had a lot of experience using OpenACC. And that's what we would like to share with you today. So the first topic will be on seismic imaging kernels, and in which we worked on automatic performance of OpenACC version of it. So I will go through the motivation, a little bit of background on the seismic imaging and the auto-tuning methodology, and some experimental results and conclusions on this part. So with the increase of complexity of the hardware and the programming environment and the languages, we have no way other than using automatic performance tuning for codes that lives typically longer than systems. And tuning the code using hand-tuning the code is typically tedious and time-consuming and requires the expertise of the developers. That's why we opted for automatic performance tuning. So in our case, we will be applying this for seismic imaging kernels. So in seismic imaging, we typically have large volumes of data that came from the seismic acquisition. Here you have a boat dragging multiple lines with geophones. Those collect traces of the data. Those will be processed and generate the image of the subsurface. So it's acoustic wave equation. This is the isotropic case where you have solving the PDE using finite difference method. It is second order in time, eighth order in space. So the code is simple, as you can see here. And the OpenACC version of it is as follows. So we add the ACC pragma parallel loops using the Ganglion vector here and managing the data using the ACC data pragma. Okay? So in our experiences, we've been playing with those parameters, and we saw that there is a potential of tuning those parameters to get the best performance. So that's what we've been doing. And we worked on the closest Ganglion vector that are basically mapping to the blocks and the threads of blocks into the GPU. So those parameters are typically set by the compiler using heuristics. However, the developer can specify those by hand and can further tune his code. So that was the auto-tuning opportunity for us, and we worked on that, and we have this automatic performance tuning model. So we have an input code here. We generate different variant of the code based on the specification of the accelerators, knowing its limits. And then we generate different variances here where we can put, so in the case of kernels, you can put different gangs and vectors here in multiple places. That was in OpenACC 1. It's slightly different now. Using the parallel, you have the gang number and the vector length, and those also are parameters that you can tune. So what we added more is the tuning is based on empirical tests. So we literally test all these parameters and all these combinations to get the best performance. However, that takes a lot of time. So what we did is we have a database in which we store all the optimization that we've done for different problem sizes, and we use machine learning algorithms to learn from this database and try to do the tuning much faster. How do we accelerate the tuning? It's basically looking at the history of all the tunings that we've done, and then we look at the nearest neighbor, and using the solution of the nearest neighbor, what we do is we shrink the parameter space, and we look at a subset of the search space on the number of gangs and number of vectors. So that's what we did in the seismic kernel that I mentioned before, second order in time and eighth order in space. We experiment in NVIDIA K20 in the beginning, and I will show some other results on different GPUs. So for the vector, the recommended values are multiple of 32. So we went from 32 all the way up to 1024 with an increment of 32. And for the gang, we went from 2 up till up 1024 with an increment of 2. OK, so the first step is to run a brute force search on 18 problem sizes that we selected to populate a history of the database. So that's the database in which we will use for machine learning later on. And then we apply the historic learning approach based on nearest neighbor on 8 different problem sizes that are not showing up in this database. And then we compared our performance with the optimal one that you can get if you are to run a brute force. OK, so those are the results on the 18 problem sizes that we selected. Those are different ranges, small and medium and large problems, and different shapes as well. And as you can see here, doing the auto-tuning definitely gives a better performance than the default choice of the compiler. In some cases, you have 10 to 20% at least of added performance. And in few cases, you have even significant performance improvement up to 2 and 2.5 times. So those problem sizes and the solution of each of one, and the solution being the optimal gang and the optimal vector values, are stored in a file, and then we apply a historic learning approach where we look at the nearest neighbor, and then we shrink this search space. So the search space initially is around like 16,000 combinations, and we shrink it to like 100 combinations only. So that will significantly reduce the time for auto-tuning. So we applied that for these 8 problem sizes. And as you can see here, so here you see in purple, that's the optimal performance that you can get if you run a brute force search. And then in blue is the performance, the speed up that you get while you are using the historic learning approach. And as you can see here, in most cases here, you can see that we are almost getting the same performance improvement by tuning the code using the historic learning approach than the brute force. So we have only 2 cases here where we had a slightly difference. Still, we have some improvement, but it's a little bit different than the optimal one. So we looked deep into the results, and what we figured out is that the nearest neighbor for this case is actually really far. So the distance, the Euclidean distance between this particular problem size and the nearest neighbor within the database is really large. So what we did is we had a heuristic in which we increase the search subspace from 100, let's say, to 300 individuals. So basically, if you see it in a 2D space of Gangan vectors, instead of doing a 10 by 10 search, we do a 20 by 20 search. And then that popped up the performance. Let me skip here. So that's exactly that problem size that has some problem initially. And then once we increased a little bit the subspace of search, we get a much better performance that is much closer to the optimal that you can get with the brute force. Obviously, doing a search on a subset and using a smart way of shrinking the search space, we increase dramatically the search time. So instead of running in hours, we run on only a few minutes. And you can see here that this is a logarithmic scale, by the way. So you can see here that the time for tuning is significantly improved and up to 50 times faster. Not only because we are doing an empirical search in a smaller subset, but that smaller subset is even targeted, and the performance of these parameters is even better. Okay, so looking at different hardware now. So we looked at 3 generations of GPUs, and we applied the auto-tuning in one specific problem size. So the compiler keeps giving the same Gangan vector numbers, and our algorithm definitely is giving different numbers for each card. And all these numbers, all these tuned parameters give a speed up of 30 to 40% at least than the basic of the compiler. All right. So in conclusion of this part, OpenACC is a promising parallel programming model for productive accelerators. Automatic performance tuning clearly give a good improvement of the performance, and we are looking for techniques such as machine learning to improve the tuning time for such applications. And in addition to that, it will help us to get a performance portability in which the application will be performant from a platform to another. So in the future work of this part, we will experiment and validate our approach on different architectures like PHY, AMD GPUs, and others, using different scientific applications. Now we are experimenting with higher order stencils. We also working on advanced search algorithms such as genetic algorithms, the Nedler-Mead, and the random search to accelerate further the tuning time. And we also plan to target new features of the new spec, such as the tile close. Okay, now I will move on to a second application of this talk, that is the fluid structure interaction code. Do you have any questions so far? I think it's a good time to stop here for the questions, if any. Yes.
I was just wondering, when you were transitioning from a traditional HPC architecture over to an accelerator and you were working with your users, how open were they to rewriting their code with OpenACC or otherwise porting it?
What was the last bit of the question?
Just how easy was it for you to work with your users? How willing were they to adopt the new coding?
Yeah. So initially, I mean, they have some resistance until lately, once we had this workshop and this hackathon, we had a tremendous interest. And user came to the hackathon, and they stay on and on till late in the afternoon, and they were really excited about it. So I would say lately, the perception of the user is getting better and better.
So one quick question, potentially one longer. You mentioned that PGI Compiler. I was wondering if you can state what version you're comparing against.
Oh, that particular one was 14.9.
Okay, thank you. And also, do you have any plans on making your auto-tuning framework more widely available? Because we're constantly getting questions from people. How can I auto-tune OpenACC? And here you're showing great results. So if you have any plans to make it available?
Yes, absolutely. So as of today, all the work is done around the RTM kernels, the seismic imaging kernels, and we would like to extract that outside. And also, I had been working with 3 or 4 students. Each of them is working on different topics, one on search algorithms, one on historic learning and machine learning, and one on doing this in parallel. Because if you have multiple GPUs, you do it at the same time, right? So we have done all these pieces, but it's just a matter of time to put things together and cleaned up to be pushed to the public domain. Yeah. Yes, there is one question.
When you were showing off the speed of comparison, what was the baseline that you based all your results off of?
Good question. The baseline was the compiler performance. So the base performance while you are using the pick of the compiler on the gang and vector values. Okay. So if there are no more questions, I will move a little bit for the next application, that is a fluid structure interaction code on accelerators. And in that part of the talk, we've been working using OpenACC on GPUs and OpenMP on Phi. So the code is basically doing the mesh motion, using a mesh motion scheme in which the mesh of the problem, we don't do a remeshing at every time step, but rather we do the displacement of the mesh, and rather than doing remeshing every time. So those are the details, how you do the definition of the mesh and the control parameters. And the applications of those are basically fluid structure interaction, and that's one of the videos that shows it. So that's basically a beam that is moving, and instead of repartitioning every time, in every time step the meshes, we actually just move the mesh with the movement of the structure. So that's a typical CFD code, and if you want more details on the physics of it, those are the references that you probably should look at. So going to the code itself, so the code reads first the mesh coordinates, the element types and connectivity, read the boundary conditions of the code. There are some nodes that are fixed and some are moving with the fluid structure interaction, and then we generate the element stiffness matrices, and we do the solve using a conjugate gradient solver. And then we have an option to write the mesh file and then repeat that in every time step. So we did a profile of this code, and the good news was most of the time was spent on the solve itself. So that was a very good candidate for porting to accelerators. So the test bed was a dual socket Sandy bridge and K20 GPUs. So you know all the specs. I don't think I need to go through those details. And we annotated the code using OpenACC. That was a photon code. And we got the following performance. So we are comparing here to the best Xeon performance. That's an OpenMP on the whole 16 cores of the Sandy bridge. And here, this is the execution time, and those are different problem sizes. So typically in CFD, in 2D, you'll be stopping here probably. That's a little bit push. But the number of meshes here probably fits what you will have, what you would have in 3D case. So as you can see here, the larger the problem, the better the speed up. That's common in many cases. And the speed up that we achieved is ranging from here, from 1.5, 1.7, up to a little bit higher than 4 times more speed up. So however, for 3D cases, the bottleneck will be the limited memory on the GPU, and which tends to improve from one generation to another. And the other solution is to go for MPI plus OpenACC and going distributed on multiple GPU. And Ahmed will share some of his experience on the next code on that. So we did this and on the GPU as well as on the PHY, and that was kind of an experiment to show our users that don't get afraid, this is not rocket science. It just took 2 to 3 weeks for three researchers, 2 developers and 1 domain scientist, get together, and we worked. One worked on the GPU, one worked on the PHY for a very limited period of time. We didn't go for the detailed tuning and all the specifics of each architecture. And we achieved a decent speed up from 2 to 4. In our case, the GPU was giving a slightly better performance than the PHY. And the main point is the energy efficiency of these codes on the accelerators. And that was one of the main issues that we have today in our data center. And that's also the reason why we're going for accelerators in our next upgrades. So here I will transition to Ahmed, who will be talking on his experience on computational electromagnetics code on using different compilers. First, he used the PGI compiler and the CAPS compiler at that time. Lately, since we got a Cray, we had access to the Cray compiler. So we had a little bit of experience on the Cray compiler. Initially, it didn't compile, and then we had to rewrite a few lines of codes and fix some of the thing. We are also not familiar with the Cray environment. So the Cray programming environment, you need to load few extra modules to have things sorted out. We also run our GPU nodes are actually with Ivy Bridge, and our main node, the other compute nodes are Haswell, so you need to have not to use the optimization on the Haswell so that it will run on the Ivy Bridge. So few things of that sort. So that's our very early experience with the Cray compiler, but it compiles and runs. It was slightly better than the PGI compiler on smaller problem sizes. But once we get to a larger problem sizes, the Cray compiler was a little bit underperforming, and PGI gave a better performance in that case. So at this moment of time, I can take questions on the second part and then pass on to Ahmed for the multiple GPU on the computational electromagnetics code. Any question? OK. Good. Then I leave the floor to Ahmed. Thank you.
Thanks, Saber. So I'm here to talk to you about my experience in OpenACC with focus on computational electromagnetics. So the concept or the science behind this is to understand the electromagnetic wave interaction with dielectric structures. Specifically, if we look at biomedical applications, laser is having a wide appeal for biomedical applications in terms of medical treatments. If we look here at red blood cell interaction, once you have had light incident on it, we want to understand how the physics is behaving. So normally, like in the medical lab, you might have a laser stream down your blood vessels to see how the healthy your red blood cells are. But then one thing that we need to kind of bear in mind is that this procedure could actually have side effects. So if we look at this plane wave interaction with my red blood cell, as propagating through, you might have confinement of the intensity of the light, which could rupture the surface of the red blood cell. So this is to allow people to understand what's actually happening in the lab. Another example is the interaction of light also with the tissue cells, organelles. So this is very important for microscopy and 3D imaging. In this scenario, you will have also light that is being shone on the sample, and we want to kind of reveal some details that are embedded inside. So if I start with my laser source that is coming from a distance, which is with a focal point shown at the middle of my sample, I want to be able to discretize my problem, take it into my code, and understand what's happening actually in the lab as opposed to the simulation as well. So the first thing that you have to do is simplify this complicated structure slightly by maybe focusing only on the nucleus and the mitochondria in this case, and you end up having this kind of discretization. Once you understand also the physical properties of my sample, which is coming from another experiment done elsewhere, we can feed in the data into my code and understand what's happening. Now, the interesting part is if we look at the simulations, this can reveal very important information. If you look, given that we're having the right operating frequency with the sample, then I can see clearly my nucleus here and the mitochondria that is floating about. So these simulations are very vital for our analysis. And the crucial point is acceleration. We would like to be able to do multiple cells of those, and we would like to compute in the fastest possible time. So how do we do that? First, let's look at the code at hand. This is based on Maxwell equation, the closed form of Maxwell equation. So we have an integral formulation, which means that for an incident light, okay, how do I go back? Okay, sorry. So for an incident band-limited light that describes my source, which is the laser, this incident field excites my sample, generates scattered field, together with the incident gives you the total field. So this is the kind of analysis that I am interested in, and I would like to analyze it. So in terms of discretization, I have my sample. I use cubic elements in this case, where the samples are located at the center of each element for the computation of the physical space. In terms of time, I'm using also linear interpolation to compute the total convolution that I have at this side of the equation. One might also notice that you have r minus r prime, which means that whenever the source point and the observation point fall in the same physical, in the scatterer, you might have singularity, but this is treated analytically. So we don't need to worry about that. After that, I have finite difference operation in space and time. So these derivatives are approximated by using second order on both cases, which are locally satisfied in space, but in terms of time, this might create some causality problems. So to maintain the explicitness of the solution, we apply the predictor-corrector scheme, which is depicted in this flow of the algorithm. So what you have is a prediction, which is operating on these evaluations, and then after you've computed this part, you go to the second part. Now, the interesting point is here is that this is an integral equation, which means that you have a volume integration. So every source point is dependent on other observation point, which result in an n-squared operation at every time step. Now, obviously, for a small problem size, this computation will be fast, and you can compute it in a short amount of time. However, as the problem size becomes large, this becomes very, very expensive, and you cannot simply solve it on one CPU. So you would have to do either parallelization or hardware acceleration. And in the first part, I'm going to talk about the hardware acceleration by using OpenACC on the GPUs, and then after that, I will move to multiple GPUs. So to give you an example of the syntax of the code that we are using, it's a C code. Here I'm talking about the CAPS compiler, which is the first compiler that we had access to after I started working with Saber on this. And as you can see here, CAPS, that version of CAPS dictated that you have the full syntax or the full kernel that you have as one unit. Therefore, you would have to apply your ACC kernels on top that takes care of transferring any data that sits on the CPU to the GPU. Once you've done that, then the computations are loaded onto the GPU and taking place there. There's no memory transfer thereafter because this is done on one unit. So all the memory sits there, the computation are done instantly. That has given us very good performance, and we were happy with that. And then, OK, the question comes to the point where if you want to break the kernels into subparts. Cray, a CAPS compiler at the time wouldn't allow us to do that, so we have made use of the PGI compiler. So as a comparison, between the PGI and the CAPS, it gives you that flexibility that you can break your code into subkernels, and each one can be treated as individual entity. So again, we made use of the ACC data here instead of kernels that takes care of transfer the data from the CPU to the GPU, which takes place before the time marching starts, which is the expensive part of our code. Thereafter, I have my spatial temporal convolution, which is the most intensive part of my code. You do this part, and then you move to the spatial finite difference operations. So this is very cheap compared to this. Now the question is basically like, how does the performance is behaving? So one thing that we need to know is also is the fact that the PGI compiler does not necessarily pick up the right parameters for your gang and vector clauses, which is the part that Saber focused on in his first part of the talk. So here I want to make a clear distinction is that only by playing with the gang and vector clauses, we were able to get such a tremendous increase on the same GPU. So this is basically a tuned version versus a base version execution. And you can see up to 25 with or at least 20 speed up you're getting on the same GPU just by making sure that you have a good tuned version on the GPU. Now, moving on from this, we want to see how does this compare to the CPU. So if I look at this slide, what you have is the amount of time it takes versus the problem size. So I have from 25,000 up to 200,000 number of elements, and my code will scale quadratically. So basically, every time you increase the number of unknowns, the computation complexity increased by a factor of 2 squared. So if I look at these performance analyses, what I'm showing here, the 1 core, 8 cores, and 16 cores. So this is, in a sense, the full capacity of my CPU and 1 card of GPUs. And that's the K20, the same machine that we've used in the previous results that we've shown. And you can see immediately that there is a huge potential here to be gained in the order of 3.67 if you compare the full capacity of the CPU to the full capacity of the GPU. So this is very good news for us. It's a tremendous increase in terms of efficiency and computation time. Now, the point is basically if you have larger problem sizes, then you might run into the problem where you cannot fit the full problem in one GPU, and therefore you have to make use of more than one GPU. And that takes us to the fact that, OK, can I make use of my code that I have originally developed for the CPU to put it in the GPU simply by only adding these pragmas? And the question is yes. So to take us into this journey to show you the results from this parallel GPU, I want to go back to the original physical problem that I have at hand, which is basically, again, the organelle. It's a complex structure. You have lots of material here. Before, I had only 2 colors that represent the nucleus and the mitochondria. Now, what I have is basically different colors that represents partitions. So you have your full problem. You want to make use of different GPUs, if you like, or different MPI processes that takes care of the communication between your partitions. And you can end up with a complex structure. So to make use of this unstructured partitioning, we made use of METIS that makes sure that you have equal number of partitions of unknowns on any 2 partitions. also part of my code requires some finite difference operation, which means that you might have some unstructured halo exchange between the partitions. So I do this as a pre-processing step. That's fine, good. Now, how does this, the communication is taking place? Now, if you remember from earlier, I said also like any information that sits on any partition needs to be transferred, part of it needs to be transferred to another partition to get you the complete spatial temporal convolution, which is an expensive operation. So this mechanism that I am showing here, we have actually implemented for Shaheen 1. So it's a CPU-based parallelization. And the point I want to highlight is that the fact that we're able to make this global dependency in terms of communication without having to rely on collective communication. So the way we're doing it is we're making use of a scheme called rotating tiles, which means that I will only have to make use of point-to-point communication to get the full information that I want. So I'm not going to go into the technical details of this. Further information can be found at this reference. But what is important for us is like how can I make use of my code, the existing code for the CPU, and take it to the GPU. So this is a very similar syntax to the description of the code that I had earlier. And what you can see here is basically I only added my MPI communications on top of the spatial temporal convolution and also for the finite difference. And I want to see how the performance looks like. So it's exactly the same system that we've been talking about. And here I am comparing, for a sanity check, just one MPI process, no OpenMP, against MPI with OpenACC on the GPU. Before, with the serial case, I was able to get up to 30. And here, again, I'm getting a similar performance. So basically, the code that I have developed for the CPU, just simply by including a couple of directives from the OpenACC, now I'm getting exactly excellent performance on multiple GPUs as well. So if I make a full comparison between MPI-OpenMP and MPI-OpenACC, again, I am getting very good performance. So here we're comparing full system to full system. 4 GPUs that are hooked to my dual socket CPU system with 16 cores. And you can see for the case where you have a large number of unknowns, I'm getting up to 11 speed up. So system to system. That's excellent. Now, in terms of the parallel efficiency, also like the scaling, here, what we are looking at exactly the same problem size, but I'm using 8 GPUs and 4 GPUs. And then I want to see like how does the efficiency in terms of the parallelization implementation that I have at hand. And pretty much I am operating at 90%, so that's excellent. Now, if I want to compare strong scaling, we made use of another system called Emerald. So this is sitting at the University of Oxford in the UK. It's slightly complicated in terms of the layout, but it has two systems, one that has 8 cards and another one that has 3 cards. But in total, that leads to 372 NVIDIA cards. And that's, I think, the previous generation to K20. So the performance in terms of the GPU itself is slightly dated to the CPU itself. But what I am interested in is the scaling. So if I look at my performance here, this is the interesting bit. Given the connectivity between the GPUs and the CPU are relying on the PCI Express, this means that you might have high communication cost. So given that I have a small problem size, which means that after I have partitioned it up to 16 parts, the amount of unknowns that sits per GPU is quite small. So the amount of time required to compute this is quite small compared to the communication. So the communication is overtaking my computation. Now, to validate this, I have used exactly the same analysis, but now instead of using like small number of unknowns, I have increased the number of unknowns, and now you can see immediately this is very nice scaling in terms of the fact that I am now able to mask my communication with the computation that I have at hand. Now, the interesting thing also is that my CPU is performing quite nicely here. It's almost super linear scaling, as shown in the next slide there, which means that now all the data that I need to crunch on is sitting in the cache. So on the CPU, this is very good. It means that I can fetch all the information I have very fast. I can compute it. And then bearing in mind that the communication cost is still constant, given that I am only relying on point-to-point communication. And also the GPU is catching up. So this is kind of leading to the fact that once we have the NVLink, where you're going to have a high bandwidth and you're going to have very fast communication, I'm sure we will be able to perform such as well on the GPU as we are able to operate on the CPU, in addition to the speed up that we are obtaining. So that's the story, basically, of my experience in porting my code on the GPU, and I was very excited and I'm very happy to kind of had the opportunity to kind of make very subtle changes to my code by making use of the OpenACC to deliver such a fantastic speed ups. And I thank you.